Jesus freak here. So, this topic kind of came up from multiple angles since I've had disputes in YouTube comment sections, other people doing YouTube videos, conversations on Discord, brainstorming with Codex GPT. But the fact that it kept coming up meant that it was obviously something I needed to think about. Now, a lot of us have our goal, our intellect, our personal understanding of the language, with its quirks, with its specific in-group vocabularies and all that stuff. And the question becomes, how do you define a certain word? And sometimes I get into situations where the main reason that there's a dispute between me and someone else is honestly we're talking past each other because we're using different dictionaries and we have different definitions for words. So, what came into play was the definition of God that I use and have always used is an entity that is beyond the comprehension of the natural realm, that is pre-existent, self-existent, and immortal. Problem is, none of that's the dictionary definition of a god. So I've basically defined the word in a way that there's one entity that God can refer to. But everyone else, it's using a completely different meaning. What's that meaning? Meaning is anything that's beyond human capabilities and that is worshipped. And certainly both those definitions can apply to God. Just that if I'm using one definition and therefore I'm saying, there is exactly one entity in all of existence from before the beginning of time to after the end of time that can be described by the word God, and everyone else is like you're full of crap. The reason for this disparity is because, frankly, I'm using a different dictionary. And I know for a fact I'm not the only person who's defined God in such a way. But while I was talking about this on IRC, I said, honestly, when you're doing this definition of God, you're not saying Jehovah is God. You're saying God is Jehovah. You didn't define the term. You basically boxed in anything that the term was meant to refer to. This was a result of some brainstorming I had been doing, both by myself and with the help of Codex GPT, where I was trying to understand certain conceptions of deity which were outside of the Abrahamic mold. And honestly, connections between non-Abrahamic faiths and Christianity and Judaism and other, related Semitic faiths. So we know there were other Semitic religions which competed with Judaism during the divided kingdom era, and even before that, and even after. One way we've dealt with the tension is mentioned in both Deuteronomy and 1 Corinthians, and that is to say, these entities don't fall under the definition of God, they fall under a different term. This is where you have, for example, in 1 Corinthians 10, we have the verse, what say then? That the idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. And a lot of people take that to say, well, what he's saying is that the word God doesn't apply there. That they're outside the definition of theos or Elohim, depending on which book you're looking at, since he's alluding to Deuteronomy 32. The thing is that if we've boxed the definition of God so tightly, it actually makes a large portion of the Bible incomprehensible. In particular, it turns Psalm 82 into gobbledygook. Now, I know people are going to say, hey, what, you turned from a monotheist into a henotheist? No. Like I said, it's definitional. It doesn't mean that I consider them to actually be gods or whatever. There's different perspectives. One could say, these entities exist, or lesser gods, and are still subordinate to the real God. And this is commonly taken tack. Or you could say, these entities exist. The proper term for them isn't God. And this appears to be the tack that Paul takes. And then there's the usual Protestant Christian approach outside of charismatics, which is to say, they simply don't exist. And that too is a scriptural approach. Any way you cut it, though, it's more of a semantic problem than a question of whether entities like this even exist or not. I don't believe they do, but, it's just semantics, more or less. Jesus freak out.